Welcome back to Godless and Grounded. We've all heard the phrase, have faith. It's thrown around like a moral virtue, like faith is the highest sign of trust, love, and devotion. In religious circles, it's even elevated above reason. You don't need to understand, you don't need to question. Just believe. That's what blind faith really is, obedience. Obedience dressed up in spiritual words. It's not curiosity. It's not exploration. It's not open-mindedness. It's submission. And when it's attached to religion, it gets a shiny label, holy. But take away the religious vocabulary, and what you're left with is someone being told to obey without thinking, to follow without questioning, to believe without evidence. That's not a virtue. That's control. Let's think about how blind faith operates. Imagine you go to a doctor and they prescribe you a treatment, but they refuse to explain what it is. They just tell you, trust me, don't ask questions, just take the pills every day. Would you feel confident doing that? Probably not. You'd want to know what the medicine is, what it does, and whether it has been tested. But when it comes to religion, people are told they shouldn't ask. They're told questioning is a sin. Doubt is the enemy. And faith is the solution to everything. But that kind of faith is just obedience under pressure. Let's be honest. Blind faith is what keeps people in line. It tells them not to explore outside the boundaries set by the religion. It tells them not to trust their own logic, not to follow their own moral compass, and not to think for themselves. It creates a system where authority is never questioned. That's not enlightenment. That's fear-based loyalty. That's mental conditioning. And it's passed down from generation to generation, not because it's right, but because questioning it feels forbidden. Blind faith is often framed as trust in God, but in reality, it's often just trust in religious leaders, sacred books, and the traditions they uphold. People are taught to accept these sources as infallible. But history tells us a different story. Religious texts have been edited, translated, and reinterpreted over centuries. Religious leaders have held immense political power, often using it for their own gain. From the Crusades to the Inquisitions to modern-day extremism, religion has repeatedly been used to justify violence and discrimination. And yet, we're told to keep faith, to keep obeying, to keep believing. Think about how religion is introduced to most people. It's not a conclusion they reach after comparing different worldviews. It's something they're born into. A child is told, this is your religion. They're not shown all the options and asked to choose. They're taught to accept one version of reality as absolute truth. That's not education. That's indoctrination. And when that child asks, why do we believe this? The answer is often, because we have to, because God said so, because the book says so. That's blind faith. It discourages critical thinking from the start. Now, let's consider what happens when someone tries to step outside of that. When they start asking real questions. Questions like, why is this book considered divine? Why does God allow so much suffering? Why do different religions contradict each other? These are not disrespectful questions, they're natural. But the moment someone asks them, they're often met with resistance. They're told they lack faith. They're warned about divine punishment. They're guilt-tripped with stories of eternal torment or separation from loved ones. That's not how truth should be protected. Truth should welcome investigation. Truth doesn't fear questions. Control does. Religious institutions have always known the power of blind faith. It's the easiest way to build a loyal following. You don't need to prove anything if your followers believe everything on command. You just need to make doubt a sin and faith a duty. Wrap it in rituals. Decorate it with holy words. Tie it to community identity. Suddenly, questioning your beliefs feels like betraying your family, your culture, and your very sense of self. That's not spirituality. That's social pressure. Think about real-life examples of where blind obedience leads us. In cults, followers do extreme things in the name of faith. They isolate themselves, give up their money, and sometimes even their lives. Why? Because they're trained to obey, not to reason. The only difference between a cult and a religion is size and time. When enough people follow, and when it's been around long enough, society calls it a religion instead of a cult. But the mechanics are often the same. Charismatic leaders, unquestioned doctrines, rituals to reinforce belief, and punishment for disobedience. Even outside of religion, blind obedience has led to horrific outcomes. In Nazi Germany, people followed Hitler blindly, thinking they were doing what was right for their country. Many ordinary citizens, soldiers, and officials were just following orders. That excuse doesn't hold up. History judges them not for doubting, but for failing to doubt. Because blind faith in any authority, religious or political, is dangerous, it allows terrible things to be done under the illusion of virtue. So why does religion still promote blind faith? Because it needs to. If people start asking hard questions, the structure begins to crack. If followers demand evidence, then the whole concept of divine revelation becomes shaky. If people start thinking for themselves, then they realize they don't need an invisible being watching over them to be moral, kind, or happy. Religion doesn't just survive on belief, it survives on unthinking belief. It thrives when people don't question. But humans are curious by nature. We are born to ask why. That's how science works. That's how progress happens. Imagine if scientists had blind faith in old ideas. We'd still believe the Earth is flat. We'd still think diseases are caused by demons, but science moves forward because it allows itself to be questioned. Religion, on the other hand, tends to resist change. And when it does change, it's often forced to, by reason, by evidence, by the pressure of modern values. Take the example of slavery. For centuries, religious texts were used to justify it. Slavery was not only accepted but regulated in many holy books. Today, most religious people reject slavery, but not because their scripture changed. The world changed. Our moral understanding evolved, and religion had to adapt or lose relevance. But that change didn't come from blind faith. It came from questioning, from rejecting obedience in favor of conscience. The same can be said for women's rights, for LGBTQ+ rights, for countless social reforms. Each time, religion was slow to catch up, and each time it was people, often outside the religious mainstream, who pushed for justice. Not because of faith, but in spite of it. That should tell us something about the limits of blind obedience. Now, some might say, faith gives people hope. And yes, the human mind can find comfort in belief. But hope is not the same as truth, and comfort is not the same as clarity. A lie can be comforting, but it's still a lie. Wouldn't it be more meaningful to build hope on honesty? On understanding the world as it is, not as we wish it to be? We don't need blind faith to be good people. Morality doesn't come from obedience to authority. It comes from empathy, reason, and shared humanity. You don't need a holy book to tell you murder is wrong. You don't need a divine command to feel compassion. These are human instincts, shaped by evolution and social cooperation. The idea that goodness must come from religion is another tool of control. It suggests that without faith, people would descend into chaos, but that's not true. In fact, some of the least religious countries, like Sweden, Norway, Japan, and the Netherlands, have some of the lowest crime rates and highest standards of living. Not because they have blind faith, but because they have built systems of mutual respect, education, and reason. So, when we strip away the holy branding, what is blind faith? It's obedience without reflection. It's submission without understanding. And that's not something to be proud of. That's something to move beyond. We can choose a different path. A path where questions are welcomed, where beliefs are earned, not inherited, where truth matters more than tradition, where morality is based on empathy, not commandments, and where we follow not because we're told to, but because we've thought it through and found it worth following. Blind faith is not noble. It's just branded obedience. And once we see it for what it is, we can begin to free ourselves from it and finally live with open eyes, open minds, and open hearts.